And so what did they find when they tested people's DNA?
When they analysed the maternal DNA, they found that a certain proportion of it, quite a small proportion of it, was the kind of DNA, it's called a haplogroup, it's a little bunch, a little section of genetic material that can be identified. There's actually genetic material that is more common in the area of the Near East. So between eastern Turkey and points further south down through Iraq and Syria and into the areas of Jordan and Palestine and modern Israel.
And what did they make of that then?
Well, they seized upon it as proof that Herodotus, way back in the 5th century, was right.
That's right.
And that the Etruscans had actually migrated from... well, the trouble is that it doesn't quite match up because Herodotus says Lydia, which is in southwestern Turkey, but the DNA actually says eastern Turkey and the Near East more generally, rather than Lydia. So they sort of slightly made a little bit too much of their results in claiming that they were proving Herodotus right. But it is an indication that some of the genetic material found in modern Tuscans has its origin back in the Near East. Now, there's two big questions to ask about that. The first is, does this have anything at all to do with the Etruscans? Because if you think about it, there are plenty of other ways that Near Eastern genetic material could have ended up in Tuscany. It could have arrived in the Roman period, with Roman slaves, which is documented in history, being carried, sold and working in Tuscany, in the fields in Tuscany, for example. Or it could be in the medieval period, where Arabs who raided Italy throughout the so-called Dark Ages could have left some of their genetic material in Tuscany quite easily. Or it could be any point subsequently, really. So the problem is trying to get some kind of dating evidence on finding out when this genetic material was transferred from the Near East into Italy. And another point, of course, is that everybody in Europe has some DNA of Near Eastern origin in them.
So it doesn't sound that helpful, really.
Well, it would be helpful if it could be more accurately dated. And there's been some attempts to do this by looking at the rate to which the genetic material mutates from one form into another. It's been possible to calculate some approximate dates as to when this genetic material arrived in Tuscany. Unfortunately, for the purposes of archaeology, the dating band is rather broad in that it goes between currently 750 BC, which is fine because that's quite early in the Etruscan period, but the trouble is that the other end of the dating range is about 850 AD. So the genetic material could have come into Italy at any point between that, which for our purpose isn't very good because that means it could be Etruscan, it could be Roman, it could be medieval quite easily. But the science is advancing so rapidly at the moment that within a couple of years that date range could well be narrowed down.
And what have the archaeological community and scientific community made of these discoveries? Has there been great excitement or controversy?
It's mixed, basically, because the archaeological consensus has been, well, I say consensus, the archaeological conviction since the middle of the 19th century at least has been that the Etruscans were people from Italy and they've always been in Italy. And it's not really been a hot topic of academic debate since the 1950s, really, when the modern subject of Etruscology and one of its founding fathers, as he gets called, Massimo Palatino, basically came to the very reasonable conclusion that actually it wasn't really an important question where they came from. It's far more important to study what happened in Italy to this people, this civilization, rather than worry about their origins, because that's not actually a question that was necessary to answer at the moment. But there are problems in saying it's not a necessary question to answer, because the key thing he published on the subject was in 1947, and of course that was immediately after the Second World War, when the question of tracing people's racial origins or identifying their racial origins was suddenly became something of an academic taboo because of obviously what happened during the Second World War with race or ethnic induced violence, in fact, in terms of what happened in the Holocaust. And so people stopped directly asking about ethnicity, and it's only since ethnic violence recurred in Europe in the 1980s and 90s, really, that it's become a hot topic again to analyse people's ethnic origins.
And do you think, is it progress in DNA research and techniques that has kind of fueled this new interest in origins? Do you think it's an example of, science driving a humanities agenda? Or
it is to some extent. Because part of the problem is that the genetic science has evolved or developed so rapidly that they now have fantastic techniques, but to some extent they don't yet know the full range of what they can do with them. Because genetic techniques can be used to identify individuals from genetic material. They might leave at a crime scene, for example, and you can identify the individuals and you can trace people's paternity or maternity through their genetic material. But there is a phase that we're going through of people trying to find out what else you can do with analysis of genetic material. And one of the things you can do, because the genetic material is passed from generation, is try to work backwards through the history of population. And some of the more successful applications of this technology have been, for example, tracing how humans colonised the world. It's the so-called out of Africa theory, and that the earliest humans or hominins started in Africa, and you can tell that because the genetic material of people still in Africa is far more varied than the genetic material of people in other parts of the world. The theory being only a few people came out of Africa, and once they were out of Africa, they subsequently divided and their genetic material mutated and changed in all sorts of different directions. But their base point was only a very few individuals, and so their genetic material is less diverse than the people who were left in Africa. And this has been one of the achievements. So what they're trying to do now with this technology is to try to answer more precise, more historical questions, not big questions like how was the Earth colonised over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, but is it possible to trace genetic, the very precise movement of human peoples in historical periods through the genetic traces of modern people. But of course, to do that, you've got to assume that people haven't moved around that much, that the modern inhabitants of an area are completely different from the inhabitants a few thousand years ago, and that's a question that still needs to be pinned down.
So just one final question really. Do you think that this work on Etruscan DNA can teach us any lessons about how the sciences and humanities could be working together?
Better is the answer. Better is the answer, because the genetic work that's been applied to Etruscans has been done without any input from anybody who studies the Etruscans. There's no archaeologists or ancient historians. It's all been done by the scientists, and they, as a result, have not actually engaged with the kind of questions that the archaeologists are currently asking, which is why they're addressing sort of where did the Etruscans come from in the first place. So we think we know the answer to that, so it's not a problem that we think needs solving. But then, on the other hand, there are some more interesting questions, I think, that could be asked. For example, is it actually credible in archaeological terms, in historical terms, that there is a continuity of population from, say, 1000 BC to the present day? Is it possible that the same people have lived in the same area for 3,000 years and their genetic material is passed down through the generations? Because if that is true, and we can prove it and demonstrate it, it kind of goes against most of what we think about history, because history tells us the Etruscans came and then they went and they were replaced by the Romans, and then the medieval period came and the Romans were replaced, and then it was the modern period, and the people changed with this. But if actually all that's changing is people's identities, their ethnicities, their political organisation, their social organisation, but it's actually the same genetic material, the same people who are breeding in the same places down through the millennia. Well, that's a very different way of looking at the past to the way we do it at the moment.
Certainly is. Well, this obviously opens up some huge and fascinating questions, and thank you very much for coming to share your research with us. And do we know the Etruscan for goodbye and thank you?
No.
Well, in English, goodbye.
Nor do we know my fee is 20,000 denarii or whatever the Etruscans used.
Well, thank you very much anyway.
It's my pleasure. Over and out.
Goodbye.